program. I want to welcome everyone. Thank you for coming and being patient with our technical difficulties this morning. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Theo Spanos-Dunphy, and I'm the President and Executive Director of Global Citizen Circle. The Circle began in Boston in 1974, almost 50 years ago, as a means of bringing together diverse groups of people who might not otherwise have met one another to engage in dialogue on critical issues, both local and global. It's always been our belief that enduring solutions to seemingly intractable problems require a sustained commitment to dialogue, conversations, and making connections that can lead to constructive change. And that's what we've committed ourselves to for nearly half a century. We've always valued intergenerational dialogue. And as we go forward to our 50th year, we recommit to bringing elders together with emerging leaders for the kind of exchanges that can benefit young and old alike, but that also strengthen and uplift the leadership capacity of a new generation. I'm very happy to welcome you to this second circle in a series of programs addressing climate change, social justice, the challenges, and most importantly, the solutions. As a small organization with a global reach, we're fortunate to have great people who volunteer as directors and global advisors to help us put these programs together. And the planning and execution of this series of climate circles is thanks to Hiten Kalan, Sean O'Kane, Nadine Hack, and Deb Ropke. And we're deeply grateful to Gary and Meg Hirschberg for sponsoring this series. I'm going to turn things over to Hiten in a moment to set the context for today's discussion. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. As many of you know, circles are really meant to be very interactive, and we purposefully allow plenty of time for questions and comments. Whether you know a lot or just a little about the discussion topic, you are welcome to engage in the conversation. So at any time during the circle, if you have a question or a comment or even a resource to share, please add it to the chat. And when our discussion leaders have finished their opening remarks, our moderator today, Rob Werner, will open the discussion to you and will call on you to unmute yourself and ask your question or make a brief comment. And please tell us first where you're joining us from. And now I'm going to turn things over to our longtime friend, participant, and Global Citizen Circle Director, Hiten Kalan, to get us started.
Thank you, Theo. Welcome everyone to the second in our series, Climate Change, a Call to Action. We are very excited to pull together this series, the second in series, partly because the Circle has, over time, realized that the issue of climate and the questions related to climate change and how we actively talk about not just what's wrong about climate, but the solutions of climate is extremely important, not to just our generation, but for future generations. It's also an issue of the time for generations that have come after most of us on this call. And I once heard someone say that for people that are my kids' age, it's the equivalent of the, at least if you're in the US, the equivalent of the Vietnam War for that generation. And that you cannot be engaged around climate issues on a day-to-day level because people are feeling it on a day-to-day level. And so the Circle decided that, you know, it's such a big topic that just to do one circle on climate would not do justice to this work. And so the idea was to do a series on this issue and try to hear from multiple voices from all over the world, not just the US, and also be very mindful of being multi-generational in terms of how people are thinking about climate issues, and particularly for the Circle, making the connection between climate, human rights, public health, democracy, and not thinking of climate as a silo issue. The Circle has historically, if you look at every circle in the past, has always tried to make connections between issues, along issues, and between people working on these issues. And we approach our series on climate with the exact same mentality. So this isn't one of those circles where we're going to be talking only about 360 parts per million and technocratic solutions. We're looking at people on the front lines that are really taking this on. And so I wanted to just take the time to set that context for why we have a series on climate. And for the circle, these are all very intertwined. And I know for many of you on this call, these are sort of very intertwined issues as well. So with that, I wanted to set the context, but also take the time now to introduce our moderator, Rob Werner, who hails from New Hampshire. He's the New Hampshire State Director for the League of Conservation Voters. Rob has a long history of working on environmental issues, conservation issues, on issues of health, and that, once again, that connection that I talked about between public health, and climate and environment is extremely key. Rob has he's been involved in teaching, has been involved in the nonprofit sector, he's been involved in the private sector, he's been involved with academic institutions. And so, Rob, you're the perfect person for us to actually bring together and moderate this fantastic discussion that I'm very excited about for today. And so with that, I hand it over to you, Rob, and the rest of the participants. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Heaton. Very glad to be part of this discussion, and welcome to everyone who is joining us today. So one of the things we're talking about today and focusing on is disparities in terms of the climate action globally and in other countries. And I was fortunate to be able to attend COP26 in Glasgow. And certainly coming out of that gathering were really two issues that were largely left unresolved. Progress was made, but so much more needs to be made. And we'll see a lot of discussion in the run-up to COP27 that's going to be happening in November, this coming November in Egypt. And those issues really are the issues of global finance and marshaling global finance, and how that is connected to this whole concept of loss and damage, which I've heard somebody simply say that it can be described as you broke it, you fix it, meaning the developed world being the chief emitters affecting the global south, global north versus the global south in some constructs, and how are all these issues going to be resolved? And they are really issues of equity, and certainly need to be addressed in order to really meet the challenge of climate change and create a good future for folks that is going to improve our environment, create economic opportunity and jobs for people, not only in our country, other countries, but globally. So I'm very happy to be a part of this discussion. I'm going to be introducing our discussion leaders today, Wanjira Mathai and Jeeva Senthilnathan. I'll start with some quick introductions. Wanjira is the Vice President and Regional Director for Africa at the World Resources Institute. She formerly served as co-chair of WRI's Global Restoration Council and a senior advisor to the Global Restoration Initiative. She's current chair of the Wanjira Mathai Foundation and the former chair of the Green Belt Movement in Kenya. An inspiring leader, Wanjira has over 20 years of experience advocating for social and environmental change on both local and international platforms. Welcome, Wanjira. And Jeeva, she's a young Indian American, hails from Colorado, and she ran for office in the town of Parker, Colorado at the age of 18. Jeeva is known for her activism in climate change, mental health, and teacher pay, alongside the policies she helped pass in gun safety in Colorado. Jeeva has received multiple national recognitions, including the 2020 Presidential Volunteer Service Awardee and a 2021 Global Teen Leader from Nile Rodgers We Are Family Foundation. So we're, again, very happy to be joined by both of you. By way of kicking off this discussion, we're going to be posing a question for them both to answer. And that question is, what life event or experience highlighted for you the disparity between how the global north and the global south view climate change? So I'm going to kick it over to Wanjira, and then Jeeva. And then, as we said at the top, after that, we'll invite questions from the audience. But over to you, Wanjira. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Jeeva, for joining me as well in this discussion. What a privilege, what a wonderful group of people gathered. Every time I'm asked to speak about climate change, Rob, your introduction in many ways captured the spirit of it. The reality is the planet is warming, and with that, we have extreme weather events that are going to become more severe, more devastating. Sadly, those who have done the least to cause the problem, and you said it, Rob, are those who will suffer the most. That really is at the heart of this whole idea of climate justice. And when I look at, there's so many examples. Obviously, often the one that comes to mind is the one that is most proximal in time and otherwise, and the flooding in so many parts of the global south come to mind, but also the droughts that are ravaging so many parts of East Africa, including my own country, Kenya. So this cause of climate justice, I like to always remind myself, is no longer just about protecting future generations from the likely ravages of this warming planet, but it's really about defending the poorest people in the world from the devastating impacts they're actually going through right now. Because I also like to remind myself that when I think of climate justice, I like to think about the injustice therein, that climate justice itself expresses several profound truths. Climate change has actually been caused by the burning of fossil fuels over 2 centuries by the richest countries in the world. It has actually indeed made them rich, but it is wreaking the greatest, the most devastating damage on the poorest countries and people. And it's actually making them poorer. Not only is it devastating their lives. This is the injustice, and it's important to keep the injustice front and center. And with that, you also can see how poverty will become even more severe. And what I also like to share and remember is that the underlying driver, the most crucial, devastating underlying driver of vulnerability is poverty. If we do not address poverty, we will not address the underlying vulnerability, which essentially renders people as far away as where the turbulence may be happening today. It's in Ukraine and Russia, and food prices and in Kenya and fertilizer are already 3 and 4 times higher. You talk to anybody in Durban today, KwaZulu Natal, or in Tunisia, and the impacts of those floods. Nadine, you shared just this week an absolutely heartbreaking narrative of what one family and others are going through. The devastating 3-year drought ravaging through Kenya and Somalia and Sudan. Without economic empowerment, a lot of this devastation is just simply unbearable and difficult to overcome. We actually know a few things for sure. We know that science has told us, and the 6th assessment report made it abundantly clear, we have to move urgently to avert the worst impacts. The youngest people seem to stand with the science, and they continue to sound the alarm. It's some of us in the other side of that divide that seem not to heed the message. And quite frankly, young people are wondering what's wrong with us. And how come we don't do anything given the devastation, even though so many, in fact, probably everyone in this group is doing so much, but it seems like such a drop in the ocean in the face of the kind of devastation we face. we are in the crisis of crisis. We have a pollution crisis, we have a climate crisis, we have a children's rights crisis, we now have a crisis in food, and we cannot and should not allow the world to look away. The irony of all of this is obviously, and I'm focusing more on flooding because I think that one helps show the great divide. The irony, and we learned this from the latest IPCC report, is that if you look at a country like the Netherlands is at greater flood risk per capita than Bangladesh, for example. But if there was a flood in the Netherlands, and if there was an equivalent flood in Bangladesh, Bangladeshis would be 20 times more at risk than the Netherlands, just purely on an economic basis. They can adapt faster, they have the technology, they have the resources. Bangladesh simply does not. But to ignore that fundamental disparity is to miss that profound point. First of all, that we are all connected. To turn away from Bangladesh or to turn away from KwaZulu-Natal is to ignore the very fact that all of us as a human family are connected. And if there is suffering in one part, sooner or later, it will come back to haunt all of us. And at a very fundamental level, I think part of our message towards COP27 is to drive home this fundamental fact that we are connected. And almost every single faith tradition teaches that. Love your neighbor as yourself. And that ought to drive a certain level of empathy and move us to action. But here's another even more contemporary truth. We are even more connected than we thought in our supply chains and how our economies work. The wealth in the north is highly dependent on what is going on in the south. Consider these three interesting facts. The beef industry in the United States is dependent upon the deforestation of the Amazon. The tech industry in Germany is driven by mining in my neighborhood here in the Congo. And the cosmetic industry in Britain and many parts of Europe is dependent upon palm oil plantations in Indonesia. And we could go on and on and on. And so the big question is, how dare we pretend or behave like we don't have anything to do with suffering that's going on far away? Yes, we lack the solidarity, and that solidarity is more needed now than ever. It is at an appalling level, the political will appalling as well, and that's why we don't see movement in climate finance. And when we have some movement in climate finance, the velocity is so slow that it doesn't come fast enough for countries to emerge. I see Nadine, and Nadine, you've always inspired me because a lot of the icons of the women's movement that I experienced, I met through women like Nadine Hack. It was Peg Snyder, it was Bella Abzug, and women who showed us what solidarity really looks like. These are women in the North who cared so deeply about what was happening in at least my part of the world, all the way in Africa. I think we didn't take that good notes because the generation that is now is just not showing that sort of solidarity. We are not showing up for each other. We simply are not. And I think we could learn a lot from the women's movement in the North that helped essentially in so many ways, lost sleep over what was going on so far away. We need to reclaim that. We need to reclaim that urgently. And I'm eternally grateful because my own mother, my late mother, Wanjira Mathai, was in trouble quite a lot. And it was thanks to the solidarity of women around the world who rallied to save her life. And it's the same today. It's that same solidarity we need to see. I could go on, but I'll stop there, Rob. Thanks.
Thanks so much. And we'll turn it over to Jeeva now.
Thank you so much, Wanjira, for your answer. Like, it resonates so much with me, and thank you, Rob, as well. But particularly this question arises for me, I would have to say, like, what the biggest life event for me was the Marshall Fire that took place in the state of Colorado. It took place in Boulder on December 31st, and it burned over about 1,000 homes. And so it's crazy because it's winter season, December 31st, and nobody would expect a wildfire that big. And so we're looking at like winds, high wind warnings of 55 to 60 miles per hour, even more to like 80 miles per hour down in Boulder. And I feel like that was one of the bigger life events for me that has highlighted this disparity between the global north and the global south, because I can just see that a lot of the global north are just like these rich leaders who do not care about people who, you know, their health getting affected or their lives getting affected in any way. And I feel like a lot of the brunt of the difficulties taken by those working in the global south. And so I would have to say that, like, you know, a lot of the bigger companies, bigger businesses that are being developed in the United States right now are, you know, it's more for comfort for a lot of the people within the United States. But, you know, when we look at like companies like Nestle or H&M or Microsoft, a lot of that uses child labor, right? Which is, you know, it's affecting a lot of the health of elders and children in the global south. But we also have like this parallel issue in the global north of like big companies wanting to satisfy their customers here. And so I feel like because of this, it's just the climate change crisis is getting, it's the bigger brunt is being taken on the global south. And so like, I want to actually go back to what Wanjira was saying, because not only did it resonate with me so much, but, you know, I have worked absolutely, like, I've worked really, really hard on many different fronts, from being like on the political front, running for office. The major that I'm taking in college right now is mechanical engineering, and I'm working to disrupt the oil and gas industry, from looking at carbon capture to, you know, sitting down with a lot of these state representatives and senators within Colorado to put an input, to input policies that like are more climate friendly. It's just, I feel like I've been working on a lot of different fronts, and, you know, the amount of discreditation that I get because I'm A, a woman, or B, a youth, it's definitely very difficult for me. And I just hope that a lot of other folks can join all of us on this climate movement, because there are, you know, a lot of other issues in the world going right now, but like, if we don't have the climate, then the rest of, then like nothing else matters, right? And so I would just have to say that in Colorado specifically, like the Colorado River is a huge resource for many other states. And so I think that particular resource is being depleted very quickly. We're seeing a lot of drought. We're seeing a lot of dryness in Colorado. And like, if you're on the news, you will hear about a wildfire almost every day within the state of Colorado, which is very, very sad. And so like, I'm not quite sure how many of you know this, but currently, like, or like on the New York Times, there was actually a recent activist from Boulder, Colorado, who set himself on fire in front of the Supreme Court, and it hit national news very quickly because, like I said, every single day there's been a wildfire, and we've already had over 1,000 homes burned down. And I also found out that these homes were actually underinsured. So now a lot of those people who don't have homes are now facing this like crisis or this difficulty. And so I just think that like we need more leaders who are caring. And it's not just like, we have to hold all these rich leaders accountable within the US, because like, if not, it's just starting to become this comfortable place. And so the term for this is this like prisoner's dilemma, right? Like, where a lot of these countries, or a lot of these like rich leaders are playing this blame game of, well, I'm not going to solve climate change, you can solve it. And I think that like, the thing about climate change is it's an issue that's not being seen clearly. Like, when you look at gun safety, you're looking at children dying, right? If you're looking at like, if you're looking, there's just like a ton of issues that I feel like people can see it clearly, and they clearly feel impacted by it. But like climate change is like one of the silent killers that nobody really talks about, or that it's just like not really, like, for rich leaders, they're just not really aware of the issue. And I feel like the thing is, we have to hold a lot of these rich leaders accountable by like making them aware of the issue, but also making sure that they stand in line with passing the right policies. And so I know that like US President Joe Biden currently was thinking about putting back in the Build Back Better plan, which would actually support a lot of workers in renewable energy, and it would include a lot of research and development, so R&D within the oil and gas industry. And I think that like policies like that are very, very important, considering the fact that the climate crisis is already here. We're facing a lot of extreme weather conditions, and I think that like what the global north needs to really do here is we need to see this parallel issue that, you know, like Wanjira said, it's the poverty. It's climate change is directly affecting the brunt of the global south, whereas it's like the global north that is causing a lot of this climate change issue. And I think that like when we're seeing world leaders within the global south, it's more of like this friendship, or this, they see like this sort of kind of like this appeal to other world leaders within the global north, that like, you know, well, yeah, it is my people, and all I care about is the election, right? Like when we look at Prime Minister Modi, I mean, India suffers this huge pollution crisis, right? Like a lot of college students are already trying to find solutions about like how to solve like the air quality, and you'll see a lot of college students in India. The last time I went, they'll just cover their noses because of how bad it really is. And I think that like it's the global south world leaders who aren't really working for the people, and they're appealed, or I would have to say that they're just they're very like impressed by like the leadership, or the prestigiousness or the status of global north leaders. And I think because of that, we're not really seeing climate change front and center, and we're just seeing like this big show, or this big party worth of rich leaders who are not really going back to help the people. And so I think that from now, like I enjoy the conferences and the talking about the climate, but I feel like we have to go a little bit more farther than that, right? And these are things that people wouldn't typically do. Recently, there was a Netflix documentary called Youth and Gov, or Youth v Gov, where a fair amount of youth actually end up suing the U.S. federal government because of the editing of climate reports at the federal level, due to trying to pretty much save the oil and gas industry. And I think that's really sad, because we know that it's a danger, but we still have leaders up in front who are thinking about saving the oil and gas industry instead of putting more R&D, or research and development, into renewable energy, and about how we can move forward in terms of A, saving people's health and making sure that they are safe, and B, also recognize the fact that this is not good for the environment. This is not good for anybody else in the world, because climate change is not just impacting one part of a country, right? This is affecting the entire world. So I would have to say that the solutions that we would have to look into is, you know, suing a lot of our government leaders, because, you know, some of them know the issue at hand, so some of them don't. We need education, we need awareness, but we also need to hold those accountable. And if that means suing, if that means, you know, taking extreme activism measures, I think like that is the only way that we're going to get across to really solving climate change, alongside like really getting into the oil and gas industry to disrupt that area. I think another side of the issue is also a lot of conservative members. I had to really go back to learn about how to appeal to conservative members and try to pull them away from the oil and gas industry by, using philosophical concepts. Like, for example, in Christianity, we would have to go back and say, well, we're taking away the earth's resources, and the earth's resources, God's resources. So how dare you take away God's resources? And I feel like that kind of got like a conservative mentality to, it really changed for them, I think. And I think that like, we really have to come together in many ways for climate change, because the climate crisis is here, and we can't have many different viewpoints where, we have this one side of the oil and gas industry playing around and saying that, well, it's going to be here for the next 50 years, so I might as well get into the oil and gas industry. We really need to start focusing on R&D and renewable energy and pretty much solving all different aspects of the climate crisis now before it gets worse, which it already is. So thank you, and I'll hand it back off to Rob.
Well, thank you both. A lot to put on the table. It's interesting you mentioned Youth v. Gov, the film, our Leader Conservation Voters team in New Hampshire. We screened that just last week at Red River Theaters in Concord, and we had a discussion afterwards with professor from UNH Law School and some other activists. And one of the things that we talked about there, we talked about it at a previous film that also featured a discussion among youth activists, was this whole aspect of, maybe I would call it sort of generational equity, because some of the youth activists, and I'd like your reaction on this, were pushing back a bit to the audience to say, look, you all, meaning folks our age, my age, you're looking to us to solve these problems. You put so much hope into our generation because we seem to, by polling and other aspects, seem to really understand this issue and will solve it. And they were pushing back to us saying, no, don't put it all on us. Don't put it all on us, our generation. I mean, we will pick up the baton, as you have, Jeeva, running for office at 18, but you guys just can't, hand this problem off to us. You have to solve it. You have to help solve it. So it was quite interesting that way in terms of that pushback. And so I'd like to know, or like to kind of understand a bit about maybe some additional perspective from both of you around that. That's a sort of aspect of what we might call so generational expectation equity or something like that. I just made that up, but maybe that captures it a little bit.
You want me to go first? Well, I think I alluded to part of the generational, I think, solidarity, which is, I think, crucial in this movement, in our understanding what is needed, but also the fact that I think for many, the part of the equity is being heard. For many young people, until quite recently, actually, when I talk to them, and I work, you mentioned, with the Wanjira Mathai Foundation, and the Wanjira Mathai Foundation is really about advancing Wanjira Mathai's legacy, especially among youth, because her legacy to the environment continues through the Greenbelt movement and other movements like that are protecting nature around the world. But the message of her life to youth was so important because she really appreciated and understood that intergenerational connection. But one of the things I hear a lot from young people is that people don't really hear us. They don't listen. They hear, but they don't listen. So when we speak, we're always trivialized, and people are just, tick a box and they say they have heard us, and they haven't, because they're not listening. And that was always really profound for me, because I never quite appreciated the fact that we tokenize so often, and part of the equity is in working against that tokenization and working to make sure that we don't tokenize. And I think that's one clear piece. The other piece that I think is interesting is just the power of young people to mobilize. Sometimes we think of this intergenerational agenda as unidirectional. It's we mentor young people. We don't remember that young people mentor us. We are working with the younger generation on this and that. But actually in the climate movement, it is the younger generation that has mobilized the rest of us. I mean, thanks to Greta, and today, I don't know who has seen her message, stop listening to me, start listening to Jeeva and others, the young people of this world. She says, I'm done talking, now don't listen to me. But she was seminal in triggering this movement that has actually moved the other generation. So there's such an important exchange between generations that's important. And I like to acknowledge that. And I must admit, it's a work in progress for those of us who don't consider ourselves youth, even though we want to think we are, that there is a real agency that young people and that generation has that we just simply don't. And it's been wonderful to see them step into the space and shake us out of our slumber.
Thanks, Jeeva.
Well, yeah, so thank you, Wanjira, because a lot of what you said, it really does matter to me about like youth and like especially youth of color taking like a forefront on this issue. And I think that like, you know, I was talking to Katie Eater, who is part of Future Coalition, and one of the difficulties we were having is a lot of white youth particularly are appreciated for, you know, stances on climate change, whereas youth of color, you know, we're beaten down. There's police brutalities. When we try to work on this front for climate. And I think that like one of the biggest challenges we've had is trying to also bring that space up for youth of color, or that same exact appreciation for youth of color. Because we're saying the same exact thing. We're not saying anything different, but we do want like the same space and that same representation. I think that like particularly in terms of climate change and voices for both men and women, I think it's a lot of women who are particularly like ridiculed. I feel like every single time I go to the Capitol, it's always like, well, you don't really know what you're saying or what you're doing. And I just think that I hope that there's more space for ecofeminism. You know, I think that's a very important concept that I haven't touched on much, but I think that like ecofeminism is something that needs to really be at the forefront, and that voice needs to really be amplified. Alongside this, I think that like even the bigger challenge that I've faced throughout all of this is R&D and trying to have people hear me and accept me or accept my research or the work that I am doing. Because I feel like whenever I'm talking about gun safety, everybody will be like, I'll put in a bill now, it makes sense. But whenever it comes to climate, it's always like, well, how will my election work? Or will I get elected next year? Or there's always like the question that comes up because of how rich the oil and gas industry really is. And I feel like we have to really, I think, mobilize and organize a brand for renewable energy and say, listen, if we want to really, you know, get ahead, a lot of these elected officials are worried about their elections and they're not really paying attention to the climate crisis right now because they're more focused on that. So we can have more climate scientists run for office or run for Congress, and we can have them be that main representation at the forefront, or we have to brand renewable energy and play this game of where they really do support our elected officials financially. And I know that like sounds so bad and so wrong, but if we want to fix the climate crisis right now, we need to have renewable energy being partnered with other elected officials side by side, so close that the oil and gas industry is disbarred. And I feel like that is the way to go about it. I feel like that's what I'm learning a lot right now in college. And yeah, I'm really thankful to people like Wanjira for saying that like youth need to be at the forefront. And I'm thankful to all the other adult mentors who have supported youth, you know, who have brought in resources or funding to make the climate strikes possible throughout, you know, internationally throughout the country. So I'm really thankful. Thanks, Rob. And thanks, Wanjira.
Sure. Switching to a little different perspective. So the most recent IPCC report painted an ever dire picture, but at the same time, it provided, I think, hope in terms of the fact that the cost of renewables continues to drop, that there's economic opportunity here. So I would like to, perhaps you could sort of comment on the whole aspect of solving this climate crisis, but providing hope for people in terms of economic opportunity and jobs and development. How does that all fit into your work and your thinking?
Rob, thank you for that question. Sometimes, and I saw that IPCC report yet again giving us a sliver of hope that yes, things are bad, but that we have a bit of time. We have what is important to also appreciate is that for some people, they're already in it. They're in the drama of climate change, so they don't see that hope that the IPCC report shares. You have a country like Kiribati that is already planning where to move its entire population. So for them, it's not as if there's time. So there's time for some. There's not enough time for many. And actually for many, that's why, and you mentioned, Rob, the issue of loss and damage. That's why the issue of loss and damage, as divisive and caustic and repulsive as it is for so many, especially the US climate delegation, they don't even want to hear you say loss and damage. I was in a meeting the other day where they said, they want to hear about loss and damage, but if you put it in small letters, L and D, but small, not big, small, I mean, anything to diminish this agenda is so important, because for many countries, look at citizens like the people in Durban, we are able to implement adaptation strategies that actually save lives. So you have in Bangladesh, we used to see, and many of you know this already, we used to see thousands of people die after every flood and every storm. Today, barely any. And so the storms that happened in Germany a few months ago that killed so many people are literally unheard of in Bangladesh. However, when those storms subside and people go back to their homes, their livelihoods are gone. Their homes are gone. So the losses and damages are about that. It's about, we're doing really well about minimizing and preventing the loss of lives, but we cannot do much about the loss of livelihoods and property. And that to a certain extent is where we are. So on the one hand, I want to be hopeful because I must. I'm an optimist, and my mother was a pathological one, optimist. And so we have to be optimistic, and we have to find every reason to push on and to have hope in humanity. But we do have 8 years, according to science, to really get our act together. And this year is almost gone, so we can say 7. But I think it's so urgent that we move and that we help the most vulnerable build the necessary resilience. That to me is the ultimate message. So sometimes when I hear this hope, I just remember that, for the people in KwaZulu-Natal, not so hopeful. I mean, it's happening.
Yeah, so thank you, Wanjira, because I absolutely can agree with you on how a lot of folks in the US don't really want to hear about loss and damage, or they don't want to really hear about it. And I think like what's difficult about most folks in the US is that, like I said, earlier onwards at the federal level, the US had already started editing climate reports so that they could save the oil and gas industry. And I feel like a lot of that loss and damage doesn't really matter, or it's really ignored. And I think like that's one thing that really sets the US apart, I think, from a lot of other countries, which is sad, especially when you have the facts and the science at the forefront. In terms of economic development and how we can really push forward renewable energy, I would have to say that like you know, now I'm starting to see a lot of engineering companies include like climate consulting, where they bring in other oil and gas folks and try to really renovate their business. A lot of oil and gas companies don't really do this, but I feel like it's sort of like almost like a campaign. A lot of these climate consulting companies have to like really far fetch out to oil and gas companies to kind of like lock them down and be like, well, here's what we can do to really renovate your business, and here's why we should do it now. And we always try to make it compelling of profits, because I feel like that's what the oil and gas industry really cares about here within the US. So like I feel like climate consulting is huge in terms of like just economic development and trying to really push people forward into pursuing the healthier climate options for us. Another, I think, like option is, I mean, you just have to be, you have to remain ethical, and you have to really have that aligned with your values, because, you know, I've met a fair amount of people, or like, you know, I'm currently a Mechie major, and I know that a lot of students, or I've met a lot of students who are studying petroleum engineering, and when I always have the difficult conversations with them of like, why are you doing this? We have a climate crisis. We should be moving towards renewable energy, towards healthier climate options. Like, why are you doing this? A lot of their answers is, it'll be here for the next 50 years, or it makes the money, or, you know, I think what the difficulties within the US that we're having is that a lot of people are kind of choked by the fact of survival. Because we already have we have a gun safety issue, we have a healthcare issue, we have so many other problems within the United States, and I think that like climate is one of those silent killers that we don't even see, or that we can't even address, because it's not up in front as other issues are. And I think that like, because of these survival issues that other people in the US are facing, we start to resonate or drive towards solutions that are probably unhealthy, or solutions that are even dangerous for us to survive. And if that means, you know, going into or taking on a major of petroleum engineering because that's going to make the most amount of money, or I feel like that's exactly what students do, is that like they're choked up by this entire by the underlying or the overlying issues within the US. And I hope that like more students can recognize the fact that, you know, there are options, and that there are ways of surviving here without having to destroy the climate. And I think that like it can be done through ways like me studying mechanical, and also like disrupting the oil and gas industry, or pursuing a political career, or, you know, even taking on business administration, where you're pursuing like carbon capture, or we're pursuing real estate, but with like a climate action or like an activism focus. I'm not quite sure how many of you know about like Eaton Hotel in Washington, D.C., but that was one of the first hotels to put an actual theme of climate action. When you walk into the hotel, it's just everything is climate. And I feel like a lot of college students right now can move towards those kinds of options, or, you know, the current folks who are in the oil and gas industry can start to renovate their businesses, where they can have like an R&D sector within their company. And I think that there's options, but people don't take it because it's either not talked about, or people don't know how to do it, or there aren't the right resources. And I feel like it's where a lot of these organizations like Global Citizen can come in to bring all of us together. So thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Heaton. So resiliency and adaptation. We hear a lot about that in terms of climate work. Obviously, mitigation is obviously very important as well, but there's so many communities that are involved with resiliency and adaptation work. So how do we merge this thinking when people's livelihoods and lives are at stake?
I think that, I mean, it's a great question, because building resilience and adapting really about essentially defending people from devastation. You know, there are so many climate events going on everywhere, and not all of them result in such devastating loss of lives or livelihoods there. So I think that part of building resilience is, how do you shore up people's ability to bounce back from adversity, and especially climate-related adversity, which seems to be the dominant form of adversity these days. And in many ways, it touches on a lot. So you look at our region, for example, in Africa, it's around the food security situation. Not only is climate devastating agriculture, because a lot of economies are rain-fed, agricultural systems are rain-fed, and so when climate changes and the rains don't come when they are, farmers don't plant, and so they're so dependent upon climate-related inputs like rainfall. And then you have, you know, the war in Ukraine, as far away as that, causing untold suffering here, because who knew we depend on Russian potash for fertilizers, and therefore now that it's not coming, or it's going to come from a different source, the prices of fertilizer have suddenly shot up by 3 times. And for farmers who are the poorest in the world, it's the big difference between how much they produce this year and therefore how much food is in the food system. And so you can see how quickly, and what that to me just shows, it's the vulnerability. That people are so vulnerable to shocks of whatever nature, and those shocks really devastate them. When you build resilience, you ensure, for example, that people can grow food more locally, depend on more local supply chains, and they're able to purchase, and they have purchasing power. Those are some of the strategies that will build resilience, and adaptation strategies go across from those to also early warning systems, so that when a flood is coming, you get the warning early and you evacuate, because saving lives is by far the most important thing we must do. But of course, that's why I think we've made great progress with that on many levels, but still not enough on protecting livelihoods.
Yeah, I think in terms of resiliency, I would have to say that, like, I think everyone should just like review a lot of the past climate, or like the past climate like challenges that we've had, like a lot of the, like I said, like the wildfire in Colorado. I think a lot of people should review a lot of the difficulties that we've had in like the past couple of years. And I think it's that should drive us to making a lot of our change. And I think hopefulness is one key aspect that comes part of resiliency, because like it's this factor of reviewing these past events, but also remaining hopeful that can help us recover quickly from a lot of our challenges, and to also drive us into taking further action. I do actually want to kind of bounce back on what Wanjira had said about like food security. And I think that particularly with that, like we have like an overproduction of crops within the US, but I particularly think that it's not being distributed out to countries internationally that could really use our resource. Instead, it's always about profits. And then it starts to become about cheap food and unhealthier options. And you always see at the store that those unhealthier options are being priced less and they're more affordable. Whereas if you look at organic foods or anything healthier, it's always priced more, and more people don't really look at what's healthy at that point. It's like what's affordable, right? And I think that like some of our issues we already have solutions for, right? But it's also that factor of how do we drive those solutions to other countries who could really use this resource. And I think that like that's also one part of like resiliency, is that we need more of the global south to come back and say, hey, we really do need these resources, especially when you have an overproduction. And when the overproduction is being used for profits, it's always like that factor of greed that comes in. And I think that, you know, we have the solution, but we're not utilizing it, or you know, other companies are just appealed to, or they're appeased by the other sorts of benefits for them, right? Rather than other countries that could really use it. So I think we need a little bit more of an urgent factor, or more voice from the global south about how we can really drive these other big companies to help internationally.
Great.
I wanted
Thanks.
to add something, Rob, that
go ahead, sorry.
Jeeva wonderfully reminded me, because one of the things that we often, I also like to point out, is that these inequities, these issues of climate justice, are not only international. Within our own countries, we have so much inequity, and we have so much, there are issues of justice. And when Jeeva mentioned the food issue, it's, yes, the food going outside, but even within a country like the United States, where you would think there should be no hungry people, that there is so much inequity, that there is inequity in where hazardous wastes are disposed, and where people actually live, sometimes in flood zones and in very vulnerable situations. My country too, in Kenya, we have outside of the international, across the board, we also have inequities inside, economic inequities. Kenya is one of them. I mean, I think there's so many countries in Africa that are like this, and I don't have to tell this group, but we have people in this country that are absolutely blistering wealthy, and then we have the most abject poverty in the world, coexisting in the same place. And so the injustice there, the economic injustice that drives a lot of injustice across the board, is also something we have to work with. So as one of my colleagues likes to say, it's like a Sudoku, it has to add up in all directions. It's the international solidarity we're looking for, but also the intra-national solidarity around the same issues.
Thanks. I want to ask folks, if they have a question, please feel free to unmute and ask that question. But before we do that, I do have a question in the queue in terms of, you had mentioned at the top of the program, sort of the faith aspect of this conundrum in which we find ourselves, and the moral aspect, and, you know, creation care. How do you see that sort of being involved in our discussion? Could you expand upon that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that there is a huge moral aspect to all of this on a very fundamental level. I think if we didn't believe in our common humanity, then I think that the multilateral system is under a lot of stress, precisely because there's such a breakdown in our common understanding of our responsibilities to each other. And I think there's so many lessons in that. The South African concept of Ubuntu, I am because you are, and that we cannot exist if the other is in suffering. And I think faith traditions in many places across the board have really served to remind us of that implicit in some of these guardrails is just the limitless edges that human beings are willing to go against each other. And I think that the faith community has a great responsibility in reminding us that we have a responsibility to the great creation. We have a responsibility to each other, and that we are custodians of this planet. We found it here, and we will probably leave it here. And my mother was always, Nadine will know this, she was always extremely humorous, and she told a lot of very funny stories, including retelling her own faith stories. And one of the ones, my absolute favorite, she used to tell this story about the creation. She would say, you know, God created the earth according to her faith tradition. She was from the Catholic faith. And she would say that, you know, in her faith tradition, she learned that the creation, the earth was created in all its wonder and beauty, was created in 7 days. And in his or her infinite beauty or wisdom, the creator created human beings last and not first, because if he had or she had created us on Monday, we would be dead by Tuesday. And so there was something about creating everything that we depend upon, the earth in its infinite beauty, that would sustain life, and only at the end of it decided to create this very destructive species called the human being. But I think that in itself has so many lessons in humility about our role in this big planet.
Yeah, I would have to agree with a lot of what Wanjira said. I think in the US particularly, I would have to say that, like, you know, there's a lot of people of different faiths, and I think that, like, faith kind of holds you accountable in terms of, like, climate and like how we can take action, and it generally, like, makes us aligned with our values, right? I think, like, a project that I had to take on during high school was there's a majority amount of Christians that we see within the U.S., and I feel like there's also this political and, like, religious, these two parties that often come together in terms of, like, conservativeness and then also Christianity. And I think that, like, a moral aspect to it, or how I see it, is that it's really about aligning folks with their values to really see the impact of the climate crisis. And I would say that, like, you know, a lot of folks see the science and the facts at the forefront, but when we're dealing with other, like, conservatives or, like, Christians who kind of put those two aspects together, we talk about how, you know, God had given us these resources and how it's important that we utilize these resources in a way that is not coming back to destroy the earth, right? Especially when God gave it to us. And I think that, like, it's about aligning with those values and also, like, kind of bringing back those facts and the science, coming together with the suffering that people are really seeing here within the US and throughout the world. So that's my take on religiousness and faith and how that can come back to climate.
Jeeva, something that I heard not too long ago is somebody made the point that, isn't it interesting, the farther east you go, those faith traditions have a deep respect for nature, and then the farther west you go, anyway, I leave that to you.
I agree. I would have to say that, like, you know, I think nature is naturally combined within faith. Like, I'm Hindu, and, you know, a lot of what I read, you know, a lot of gods, right, within within Hinduism in general, you know, they're all animals, and we have, like, this respect, right, for animals. But when the United States, you know, it's not really like that. It's about utilizing all the resources. And I think yeah, it's really just about coming back and putting those science and facts along with, you know, it's important that people are suffering within faith and bringing that concept out. So I think, yeah, I would have to agree.
Thanks. I'm going to call on Anna Hill from Suckaway Europe, who's with us, and she has a comment to our discussion. So I'll turn it over to you, Anna. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and fascinating discussion. Thank you to the speakers, and for raising the point also on the importance of solidarity across the North-South divide, as well as between inspirational female leaders, and regaining that sense of urgency, which we seem to have perhaps lost through the systems we've accepted as the norm. So I think some of the points that Wanjira was bringing up about the how interconnected we are, not just through our faith and our reliance on the natural ecosystem, But if we look at the damage and loss scenarios, industries in Germany, mining from the Congo, and how we have to embrace the bigger picture and take a very interdisciplinary, non-siloed approach. And I think women are very much on the forefront of this move. Some of the issues, the complex issues between the interrelationship between industry, the food shortage, the militarization of governmental breakdown, that we have to find solutions. And one solution which we are working on in collaboration with engineers, we're currently starting a European-based innovation SME based in Dublin. And we're currently in discussion with engineering partners to deliver a locally based solution which provides floating cycling infrastructure and provides the local community energy and other provisions. It's very much aimed at disrupting this corporate approach to just profit before actual delivery. So we're working very hard. We've got a good female leadership stepping up, and it's just an interesting space because I don't think that we have addressed things by taking a more transformational approach to how we can deliver urgent values-led solutions that are very much feminine in my view. And it's not excluding the male contributions. It's recognizing that some of the crises that we currently find ourselves in, Ukraine and the climate crisis having such a shocking effect on the most vulnerable, we need to take a collective approach to. So I just wanted to thank the speakers and also thank Nadine and Theo and all involved in the circle for bringing these discussions into focus. And I do believe that the younger generation and intergenerational approach, an educational approach is also key. So thanks for giving me this time to just share what we're doing.
Thanks, Anna. Do you, Wanjira, Jeeva, do you have any comments on what Anna has brought forward?
Love what Anna has said. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And Anna, even the comment you put in the chat as well, I think covers this whole idea of a systems approach that is crucial. The lost sense of solidarity. I resonate with what Anna said. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you're working on an engineering front and also on many different fronts for this the work that you're doing. And I think that, like, you know, the more kind of sustainable solutions you spread, I think everybody can take a piece of it. And I'm really thankful for the ecofeminism because I feel like that's what we need more of. And I'm glad that that is a voice that's being brought up front. So thank you.
Thank you both.
We do have time for some additional questions. So if folks have them, please unmute and ask. Dot Courier, you have a question.
Hi, I just was thinking about the stories of various indigenous people's stories of creation, and as people were talking about the values-based stories that they have, if there were resources, if there was a book that brought together several different indigenous stories to bring that whole moral responsibility issue to the fore, or I'd be great to have numerous children's books, or maybe there could be something on YouTube or things like that, where people don't necessarily read, but they'll watch something like that. I just think stories is the best way really to help change people, because it speaks to the emotions and it affects people rather than thinking about putting something on a piece of paper. So I just wondered if you knew if there was anything going on along those lines.
Dorothy, I was actually just typing into the chat that there is a book that my mother, Wanjira Mathai, wrote. It was her last book, actually, and it was called Replenishing the Earth. And it was actually about exactly that, looking at different faith traditions, and it captured, the Jewish tradition, all these different traditions, and how the whole idea of custodianship of the planet was in so many different faiths around the world. I've put it in the chat.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm actually not quite aware of like children's books particular, but here is a book of my friend. He's Indigenous, and he's also queer, and he works on the climate front with me in Colorado. And his story was put in this book, I believe. So I think that if I'm not quite sure if you're willing to write any like children's books, but I have lots and lots of Indigenous youth who would love to get their story out. And, if you know someone who is willing to do that kind of work, I'd be more than happy to pass off the International Indigenous Youth Council to anyone who is doing this work. So yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. We have time for a couple more questions before we're going to start wrapping up. So if folks do have questions, please, again, feel free to unmute and ask the question. Thank you.
I have a quick question. My name is Eric. I'm coming from Southern Maine. So I put it in the chat box too, but just to read that, there's also the aspect of mental health impacts stemming from inaction on the climate crisis. That's becoming a real issue for many of us, also known as climate anxiety. Could you all speak to that at all, or maybe have any advice or words that are experiencing that sort of thing?
You unmuted it, so it's okay.
I had a hard time hearing that question. Rob, do you want to repeat what the question was?
Yes,
something
Eric
about climate anxiety, I heard.
Yes, I think there's a lot of discussion around mental health aspects of climate anxiety and so forth, particularly among youth. And Eric was asking your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think there's a very interesting concept. Yes, the climate anxiety concept is obviously one that is quite live right now. Actually, when the last IPCC report was released, there was a discussion around a heightened level of climate anxiety, and the fact that the climate anxiety is the result of this terrible news that we keep releasing report after report, and that young people are having a hard time processing it. But actually, when I spoke to some young people about that, what I found out is that it's not so much the bad news, that it was the anxiety was not so much the bad news. And I said, to the young people we work with at the foundation, I said, would you rather that we tell, that there is trouble coming, but not heighten it and make you have anxiety, that surely we don't want to overburden you with the bad news? And these young people said, no, we don't want to hear any sugar-coated messaging. We don't want to know that things are good if they're not. In fact, we want to know the dead truth, how bad things are. The anxiety we have is not so much from the news, it's more from your inaction. We cannot believe, given the information out there, given the science, that there are still people who are asking what exactly is going on. So it is the inaction that is causing anxiety, not so much. And that's why we have to make this agenda. And even the COP20, COP26 was wonderful in raising awareness, bringing messaging. The sense of urgency was so clear from young people. What are we going to do in COP27? Surely we can't do the same thing. So that level of action is what we're looking for. And that's where I think that anxiety comes from. It is real. They did say from a recent survey, a lot of young people said they're afraid to get married. They're afraid to have children in this world. There are some real indicators of anxiety. They just don't feel secure. Their future is uncertain. Just a significant, and what that means when you live in a world that you actually do feel this sense of urgency. As you can see, I'm dealing with a very rowdy bunch of children in my background here. My apologies.
Yeah, in terms of the anxiety, I would have to say like Wanjira covered a lot of what I wanted to say, but like I had previously mentioned, you know, the Netflix documentary with Youth v. Gov. I mean, the entire point of why youth sued the federal government was in the first place was because of the inaction, is because they edited climate reports, right, to support another industry, and we knew it was dangerous, but they still did it anyway, right? And it's the ignorance and the inaction, I think, that what makes us feel that anxiety. And I think that like the only way to push forward away from that anxiety is by taking, I would have to say, some harsh actions, by holding other elected officials accountable in a manner that we don't typically hold them accountable, right? Like, I feel like just talking or holding a conversation with the state representative or state senator or anybody at the federal level, you know, it's just going to be a sugar-coated conversation, I feel like, always. And I feel like in order to really move away from that, we have to, you know, we either have to have something drafted, we have to do something with mobilizing and organizing or funding one's work, or I think that like it can come through a form of suing. You know, I feel like we have to take like harsh actions in order to really move away from that anxiety. And I think that like the action that we take is going to help us with that. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. It is getting a lot of attention these days, this anxiety issue, but I thought it was interesting that it's based on inaction and not the actual events. So thanks for that perspective. I'm going to call on my old friend, Wayne King. Wayne has some perspective and comments. So take it away, Wayne.
Hey, thanks, Rob. I would say that one thing that I want to suggest is that I just finished doing a nonviolence training for direct action. And I think that along with suing, and especially suing the oil companies, by the way, we need to be taking some direct action to try and shut down some of the major sources of carbon out there, particularly coal. But I want to tell everybody that I think that there's a real gem available to all of us in the legends and lore of the Lakota people. And I put a link to a YouTube video where Phil Deloria, grandson of Vine Deloria, who wrote "Custer Died for Our Sins," he talks about the legend of the white buffalo, and and he makes the case that the Sioux people, and this is actually true of many of the Native American nations, believe that we have just reached a 500-year point where the major crises may be behind us, and we have the opportunity to move forward as global citizens, if you will. And I think you might enjoy watching Phil Deloria talk about that, and thinking about how the indigenous people, not only of the American continents but of the world, can help to lead us toward a more rational way to look at all of these problems. That's perhaps, even if you'll forgive me for saying so, less tribal than it sometimes gets these days.
Thanks, Wayne. We appreciate that the contribution and to our discussion. And we're going to wrap up with one last question from Alicia Parker. Go ahead, Alicia.
Yes, hi everybody. And I want to thank our speakers today. It's a critical topic. I'm here in the United States, and we had a legislation that we had put forth, two pieces of legislation. One, an infrastructure project, a physical infrastructure, and the other one was an infrastructure of people. You know, and a big part of it was dealt with climate change and mitigation of climate change. And we had some very brave women, and I agree with Jeeva about ecofeminism. You know, we had some very brave women trying to push this through. They were even holding the infrastructure bill hostage, you know, to try and push through the climate change and the people, the legislation that supported people through, and couldn't get it done, and could not get it done. And I'm not a pessimist, you know, but I think my thing is Florida's going to have to be under 6 feet of water before anybody, and New Orleans under 6 feet of water before anybody in the United States of America says there's something going on, something wrong. And those people migrating to the north, and it's going to have to be something severe like that to change the minds of people in the United States. That's just my opinion. Now, Jeeva, you're here, right? So I think that maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, I can actually shed a lot of light on that. A particular experience that I had in Colorado was just this past year, or the past last year, we were trying to pass Senate Bill 21-200, which actually focuses on environmental justice and making sure that like Colorado can stay on track to its emissions, and making sure that, you know, we're reducing emissions. And you know, like you said, there's a lot of women who are in power who you know are trying to put in the right legislation, but it's always not getting passed, or it's always disbarred. And like you know, that bill SB 21-200 was the bill, and it was vetoed by the governor, actually, which was very, very saddening for me, because I had spent almost like, I can't even say like how, like countless amount of hours on that bill, and it was still vetoed by the governor. And I think that, like, you know, we're going to be dealing with a lot of this frustration, especially when it's like ignorance, or, you know, or even like, I would have to say the biggest difficulty that we're facing in the US is, especially at the state level, is the amount of elected officials, or even I would have to say conservative Democrats, who are bought by the oil and gas industry because they give a good amount of money for their campaigns. And I feel like, you know, that's the same exact issue within New York. You know, it happens in Colorado. The governor's bought by, you know, the governor's queer, he's Democrat, but he's bought by the oil and gas industry. And the same thing is happening in New York. It's happening all around the states within the US. And that's why I just want to shed light on saying the fact that we need to really brand up renewable energy and say, you know, if this is about getting folks elected, then we need to have renewable energy beyond that front, rather than the oil and gas industry, right? Like, we need elected officials to start depending on the route for renewable energy rather than oil and gas, you know, if we're looking at in terms of financials. And I feel like a fair amount of people had told me that that's dirty, but the thing is, like, you know, it's either we need to have climate scientists running for Congress or for any other office and for them getting elected, or we need to have renewable energy kind of pass off some of that money, which is going to have elected officials do more on that renewable front. And I hate that it's a bribe deal, but that's the way that the world is currently working. And if we're talking about solving the climate crisis in an efficient manner or in a fast manner, I feel like this is the route we have to take. We have to jump into this dangerous, I don't want to say dangerous zone, but this unethical zone, before it can get better. It only gets worse before it can get better, right? So that's what they say. That's my friend. That's my take.
Well, thank you all for a lot of provocative conversation and questions. We're going to be wrapping up our program today. It has been recorded, so it is available for later viewing. So I am now going to turn it back over to Heaton for some closing remarks. And again, thanks to our guests for joining us today, and thanks for everyone who tuned in. Over to you, Heaton. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Jeeva. Thanks, Wanjira. This was, as always, incredibly enlightening, productive, inspiring, intriguing, and while I always learn a ton of these, I leave with more questions than I came with, which, in my case is always a success, because one of the things I'm learning as I get older is I know less and less, and each time I talk to other people, I learn more and more. So I really thought this was an excellent conversation. I really appreciated the multiple perspectives that everyone brought to the table, and thanks everyone for participating. And with that, I will ask Theo to close us out.
Thank you, Heaton, and thank you, Rob and Wanjira and Jeeva, everyone who asked questions, and to all of you who listened and learned. And I want to thank again Gary and Meg Hirschberg for helping make this series possible. And we're very, very grateful and look forward to our next climate circle, which you will all hear about through an email. And we don't have a date, but we will be in touch, and we will send this recording of this event to all of you, along with all of the resources as a follow-up to this. And we encourage everyone to continue the conversation. It doesn't stop here. And for those of you who have to jump off now at 11:30, please feel free to. We often stay here. We always stay here a little longer after this formal part of the program is over, in case anybody wants to just have a little bit of informal chat. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you the next time.